The conflict between Israel and Iran, often framed through the lens of proxy wars and nuclear ambitions, has been a defining feature of Middle Eastern geopolitics for decades. At its core, the rivalry is not merely bilateral but deeply intertwined with the broader strategic interests of the United States. To understand what is necessary for an end to this multifaceted confrontation, one must first dissect the foundational elements of the triangle. Iran, the Islamic Republic, has long pursued a policy of challenging the existing regional order, supporting proxies like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and various militias in Iraq and Syria. These groups serve as both a deterrent and a means to project power beyond Iran's borders. Israel, on the other hand, views Iran's nuclear program and its entrenched presence along its northern borders as existential threats, leading to a campaign of covert operations, cyberattacks, and targeted assassinations. The United States, though sometimes oscillating in its approach, has historically backed Israel militarily, diplomatically, and economically, while also engaging in its own confrontation with Iran through sanctions and military posturing. The Trump administration's withdrawal from the JCPOA in 2018 and the maximum pressure campaign hardened Iranian resolve, while the Biden administration's attempts at diplomacy through indirect talks in Vienna have not yielded a return to the nuclear deal. This complex interplay of hardened positions, mutual distrust, and zero-sum calculations creates a perpetual state of tension. Resolution, therefore, requires addressing not just the symptoms but the underlying security dilemmas. For Israel, the red lines are clear, preventing Iran from achieving nuclear weapons capability and rolling back its entrenchment in Syria. For Iran, the demands revolve around recognition of its regional role, lifting of crippling sanctions, and security guarantees against regime change. The United States, as the indispensable power, must broker a comprehensive framework that moves beyond the nuclear issue to include missile programs, proxy forces, and regional security architectures. Such a grand bargain, however, faces severe domestic and regional hurdles, including opposition from Gulf states and internal hardliners on both sides. At the heart of the Israel-US-Iran conflict lies the nuclear question. Iran's uranium enrichment program, advanced to levels close to weapons-grade 60% purity, has dramatically shortened its breakout time, the period needed to produce enough fissile material for a nuclear bomb. According to the IAEA, Iran has enriched uranium to 60% at its underground Fordow facility and is now producing metal uranium, a key component in nuclear weapons. This progress has alarmed Israel, which considers a nuclear-capable Iran an unacceptable risk. The JCPOA, negotiated in 2015, had restricted Iran's enrichment to 3.67% and capped its stockpile, but its collapse opened the door for Iran's current advances. A return to the JCPOA under the Biden administration appears unlikely due to Iran's demands for guarantees that no future U.S. president will abandon the deal and for removal of sanctions on the IRGC. Moreover, the IAEA has identified traces of undeclared nuclear material at several Iranian sites, raising questions about past weaponization work. To end this impasse, several key conditions must be met. First, a verifiable freeze of enrichment at current levels, followed by a phased reduction to JCPOA level caps. Second, enhanced inspections and monitoring, including access to suspected military sites and the use of advanced technologies like tamper-proof cameras and real-time enrichment monitoring. Third, a sunset clause that addresses Israel's concern about the JCPOA's limited duration, ensuring caps on enrichment remain for at least 20 years with the possibility of extension. Fourth, a separate agreement on Iran's ballistic missile program, which is designed to potentially deliver nuclear warheads. While Iran insists its missile program is defensive and non-negotiable, any comprehensive deal must include restrictions on missiles with ranges over 300 kilometers and on development of intercontinental missiles. Without these elements, Israel maintains the position that military action against Iran's nuclear facilities is a credible military option, and the United States, while preferring diplomacy, has not ruled out force. The path to peace requires both sides to accept that a zero-sum outcome is impossible. Iran needs economic relief and security guarantees, Israel needs assured prevention of a nuclear breakout. Beyond the nuclear issue, the Iran-Israel conflict manifests through a network of armed proxies that serve as strategic assets for Tehran. Hezbollah in Lebanon, formed with Iranian support after the 1982 Israeli invasion, has evolved into a conventional military force with an arsenal of over 150,000 rockets and precision-guided munitions. Israel's 2006 war with Hezbollah ended in a stalemate, but the group's continued buildup along the border, including tunnels and advanced anti-ship missiles, remains a primary threat. In Syria, Iran has established a military presence, including IRGC advisors and militias, to support the Assad regime and build a land bridge to Hezbollah. Israel has conducted hundreds of airstrikes in Syria to impede this entrenchment, targeting weapons transfers and infrastructure, but the underlying dynamic persists. In Yemen, the Houthi movement, armed by Iran, has attacked Saudi Arabia and internationally recognized vessels with ballistic missiles and drones, but has also shown capacity to target Israel, as seen during the 2023 conflict. These proxy forces are not just a means of pressure but also a potential trigger for wider war. For an end to hostilities, the proxy system must be dismantled or transformed. This requires a regional security framework that integrates Iran while providing guarantees to its neighbors. One model is the Helsinki process for the Middle East, where all parties agree on principles of non-interference, mutual respect for sovereignty, and arms control. Specifically, Hezbollah should be integrated into the Lebanese state as a non-state actor within a national defense strategy, disarmed under UN Resolutions 1559 and 1701, and its role limited to purely political functions. In Syria, a complete withdrawal of foreign forces, including Iran's, facilitated by a political settlement, would reduce tensions. In Yemen, a ceasefire and peace talks should include strict verification of no arms transfers to the Houthis. The United States can use its leverage with Israel and Gulf states to offer incentives such as normalizing relations with Iran, economic investment, and security cooperation in exchange for Iran's restraint. However, these steps require trust-building measures like prisoner swaps, lifting of sanctions on humanitarian grounds, and opening of diplomatic channels. This is a long-term process, but without addressing the proxy infrastructure, the risk of escalation remains high. Economic pressure, primarily through US and European sanctions, has been a central tool in containing Iran, but it has also deepened the conflict. The maximum pressure campaign under the Trump administration targeted Iran's oil exports, banking sector, and the IRGC, designating it a foreign terrorist organization. These measures choked Iran's economy, causing inflation, unemployment, and social unrest, but they did not force Iran back to the negotiating table on US terms. Instead, Iran accelerated its nuclear program and increased its regional assertiveness. The Biden administration has continued many sanctions while holding indirect talks, but Iran insists on full normalization of its economy before any nuclear concessions. The key to breaking this deadlock is a phased and reciprocal lifting of sanctions tied to verifiable nuclear and missile restrictions. A possible framework is the Sanctions for Nuclear formula, where Iran stops enrichment above 3.67% and reduces its stockpile, and the US removes sanctions on non-entity designations, allowing oil exports and banking transactions. However, the IRGC designation complicates matters. Removing it would likely face bipartisan criticism in the US and be seen as rewarding terrorism, while keeping it prevents any comprehensive deal. A compromise could involve a time-limited suspension of the terror label for diplomatic purposes, subject to periodic review. Additionally, the EU and Russia can play a role in establishing a dedicated payment mechanism, like an expanded SPV, to facilitate humanitarian trade independently of the US dollar. On the Iranian side, economic reforms, including joining the FATF standards and reducing dependence on oil revenues, would be necessary to rebuild investor confidence. For Israel, the economic dimension is less direct but critical. Improved Iran-US relations could lead to Israel losing its qualitative military edge in the region through increased arms sales to Gulf states. Therefore, any sanctions relief must be calibrated not to alarm Israel or undermine its security. Ultimately, economic warfare can only be a complement to diplomacy, not a substitute. The endgame requires a grand bargain that restores Iran's economy to health in exchange for verifiable and durable restrictions on its military and nuclear programs, with a clear path to normalization and integration into the global economy. Without this, the current cycle of pressure and defiance will continue. Domestic political dynamics in all three countries profoundly shaped the conflict's trajectory. In Iran, the struggle between hardliners under Supreme Leader Khamenei and reformists who favor engagement has swung from the JCPOA-era détente to the current maximalist stance under President Raisi. The IRGC's economic interests and its role in the political system resist any opening that might threaten its power. The 2022 to 2023 protests, initially triggered by Mahsa Amini's death, showed popular demands for freedom and economic relief, but the regime's crackdown also demonstrated its resilience. For a peace deal to be sustainable, Iran's leadership must perceive that the benefits of agreement outweigh the costs of concessions and that the risk of regime change is off the table. In Israel, the political landscape is more pluralistic but deeply polarized. The Benjamin Netanyahu era saw a shift toward confronting Iran directly, with a focus on preventing any deal that leaves Iran with nuclear capability. The broader Israeli public, while viewing Iran as the primary threat, has varying levels of appetite for military action. A national unity government might be necessary to pursue bold diplomatic moves. In the United States, presidential elections create cycles of policy, Trump's transactional approach, Biden's commitment to diplomacy, and future uncertainty. Bipartisan consensus supports Israel but differs on dealing with Iran. Within the U.S., a vocal opposition to any deal that legitimizes Iran's regime often blocks progress. Overcoming these political hurdles requires visionary leadership willing to take risks for peace. For example, a new Israeli government could endorse a regional NATO model that includes Iran if it verifiably abandons its hostile policies. Similarly, a U.S. president could invest significant political capital in a comprehensive deal, overcoming congressional opposition through a detailed roadmap and security guarantees. Iran's supreme leader might pass the mantle to a successor less entrenched in the revolutionary paradigm, or the reformist camp could gain momentum from improved economic conditions. The key takeaway is that the necessary conditions for ending the conflict are not just technical but deeply political. Any solution must align with the interests of key domestic constituencies and emerge from a shift in the political calculus of decision-makers. Without internal buy-in, especially from the IRGC and the Israeli security establishment, even a signed agreement would be fragile, as evidenced by the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA. Thus, a simultaneous track of confidence-building measures within each country is essential. Concluding this analysis, the essential prerequisites for ending the Israel-US-Iran war, or preventing its escalation into a full-blown regional war, are clear but immensely challenging. They form a comprehensive package that goes beyond the nuclear file. First, a renewed nuclear agreement with stricter protocols, longer duration, and a verification mechanism that includes snap inspections and remote monitoring, perhaps based on the model of the IAEA's additional protocol plus Iran's ratification of the CTBT. Second, a missile program freeze and cap, with a verifiable ban on development of ICBMs and space launch vehicles capable of delivering warheads. Third, a regional non-aggression pact that includes Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and other states, where all commit to non-interference in internal affairs, respect for international borders, and resolution of disputes through arbitration. This could be linked to a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. Fourth, a phased and monitored dismantling of proxy forces, contingent on Iran's verified compliance with the above, and parallel normalization of Iran's relations with Arab states and Israel. Fifth, a comprehensive economic package, full sanctions relief, investment in infrastructure, and trade integration for Iran, combined with security and economic incentives for Israel and Gulf states, such as advanced defense systems, missile defense cooperation, and technology sharing. The United States would be the guarantor, with a multilateral verification mechanism involving the UN, EU, Russia, and China. However, the realism of this vision is uncertain. It requires a Herculean diplomatic effort, trust that has been eroded over decades, and the willingness of all parties to make painful compromises. The alternative, continued escalation, cyberattacks, and potential military conflict, carries catastrophic risks. A single miscalculation could trigger a war causing massive casualties and economic disruption. The international community, particularly Europe and the Gulf states, must step up mediation. A plausible first step could be a humanitarian ceasefire in Syria and Yemen, followed by a freeze on nuclear activities, leading to a broader framework. Ultimately, the question is not just what is necessary, but whether the leaders in Washington, Jerusalem, and Tehran have the foresight and courage to seize the opportunity. The status quo is unsustainable, a new equilibrium must be forged. The script ends, but the story continues. The ball is in the court of diplomacy.